Hi, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tim Cohen, your moderator, and we're looking forward to a deep dive into cybersecurity, specifically around data breaches. Before we get started, let me do a couple of housekeeping to-dos. Number one, we'll be together about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some live Q&A at the end. The best way for you to get your questions in is to type those into the Q&A box at any point. Our guests today will be able to see that. Some of those we'll address on the fly as you raise the questions, and some we'll keep track of and pick up at the end. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll send you a link sometime in the next day or two afterwards, so you can rewatch this or share it with your team. And for those of you that are here live, you'll receive one CEU. You'll get an email in about 48 hours with instructions on how to claim that. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do some brief introductions, and then we'll begin our conversation today differentiating between what's an incident and a breach. And then what we're going to do is really walk through chronologically some of the things that you will go through if you experience a breach. But before that, let me introduce our three guests, or actually have them introduce themselves. First of all, we're really pleased to be joined by a couple of our friends from the Coker Group. We at Focus Solutions are thrilled to partner with Coker on a whole variety of things. And let me begin with Roz Cordini. Roz, welcome, and give
Thank
people
you.
a brief overview of both Coker and what you guys do if they don't know, and your background.
Sure. Great to have everyone signed in today to listen to our webinar. Roz Cordini with Coker Group, as Tim said. Coker Group's a healthcare consulting firm. We've been around for over 35 years, and we practice in three particular areas around transaction advisory, compliance services, and performance transformation. I am Senior Vice President of our Regulatory Compliance and Audit Service line. And my background is I'm a registered nurse and healthcare regulatory attorney. Joined Coker 7 years ago to develop the compliance service line, where we do all things OIG compliance, HIPAA privacy and security, and provider audit. So great to have everyone here. Thanks, Tim.
Raj, you create great conflict for people. You're a nurse, the most trusted and compassionate profession, and an attorney. So we're really glad you're here. Also
Thank you.
from the Coker Group is Deanne Tucker. Deanne, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to join everybody today. As you mentioned, Deanne Tucker, and I also work as a consultant at Coker Group under Roz, and my primary focus there is HIPAA compliance. Before joining Coker, I worked for a large health system where I was the privacy and security officer. So definitely have that perspective from being in the trenches. So I look forward to talking to everybody today.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Welcome, Deanne. And then finally, my colleague at Focus Solutions, Tim Grilling, who's our Director of Information Security. Tim, welcome. Give people a brief overview of Focus Solutions and then your background.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Focus Solutions is a service provider in the healthcare space, helping organizations to manage their IT environments, manage security, as well as data services around EMRs. We help improve operational efficiencies and enhance patient care by effectively and efficiently managing IT environments and security within organizations. My background, I've been doing security risk compliance for 25 plus years in a variety of different organizations and in a bunch of different industries, including healthcare. Healthcare has been my focus over the last few years, and security risk compliance changes often, so have to stay on top of it. And glad to be here to speak to a very important topic.
Awesome. I'm glad to have all three of you here, particularly since this is not a fun topic. We're going to talk about what happens when it all goes wrong. It feels a little bit like the scared straight presentation we all heard in high school on, stay off drugs or bad things will happen. But I would say the audience is in good hands, because across the three of you, as we prepared for this webinar, there's just an incredible depth of experience on today's topics. Really glad to have you all here. Let's begin the conversation. And Deanne, I'm going to start with you because you did ride this role inside a provider organization that is a covered entity and that has all those responsibilities. Where something bad happened. But before we get into the particulars of today's discussion around a breach, first of all, what's the difference between an incident and a breach? These are a couple of terms that get used in the security world. What's the difference and why does it matter what one is versus the other?
Well, I think the important distinction is that, you have incidents, organizations have incidents common. It's common.
Okay.
The important thing is that you don't label it as a breach too soon.
Okay.
That you do your diligence, you gather your information that you need, you do a risk assessment based on the criteria HHS says, evaluate the situation and determine if there is a breach. And typically that takes a little while. You need to, gather all your information. So I think it's important for organizations not to be too quick to call something a breach.
Seems like one of the really important things is the word breach carries a very definitive term. These are not just labels that the security professionals like you all have thrown around. There is a specific meaning. Roz, from a legal point of view, why is it important to be careful on when you declare it a breach?
Well, because once you declare it a breach, there's a cascade of events that will have to occur. And so if we step back for just a moment, an incident, as Deanne mentioned, happens all the time. And it could be something as you see somebody on the IT side of your monitoring who's trying to or successfully penetrates a firewall or something. That's an incident. It's unauthorized, but it takes a little more diligence to find out, well, is any PHI compromised? Do we really have a breach situation here? So that analysis, as Deanne said, is just really critical, to make that determination, because this all comes down to, is the bad guy compromising, or is any of our patient data or other sensitive data being compromised? And that sets us down this other path, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, but there's lots of steps then that we're triggered to do once we call it a breach.
Yeah. Tim, you're on the IT, the technical side of this. When you try to give lay people like me, like a rule of thumb, like if it's X, it's incident. If it's Y, it's a breach. And here's where you sound the alarm and call in the pros. Do you have a back of the napkin kind of set of guidance for non-technical people on how to think about when they've crossed the line into a breach?
Yeah, it's funny. I think you were just reading my mind because I always like to use analogies. And I think of, we all work in the healthcare space, right? Helping healthcare organizations. I think of incident and breach in terms of healthcare, right? So, if I hurt my knee, right? My knee, I have pain, I have swelling. That's the incident, right? Those are the indicators that there's something potentially wrong, right? And then I have to go to the doctor to do an X-ray, do an MRI to see, did I tear my ACL, right? That's the breach, right? The breach is really, in the IT space, right? I have alerts daily with, phishing emails that are coming in and endpoint protection solutions throwing up alerts. Then you have to dig in to see, okay, well, did someone actually access that system and were they able to get access to data, right? That's when the breach occurs, where you see definitive evidence that data has been exfiltrated or data has been accessed.
Okay. Today we're going to focus from here on out on the breach and not being technical. My definition of a breach is, as a business leader, somebody called me and my first response is probably not something I would want my mother or my Sunday school teacher to have heard coming out of my mouth. It's a holy cats moment. We now know something bad's happened. So let's pick it up from there. And we're really going to kind of work chronologically to the extent we can. Let's start with the first question. How do you typically know that a breach is happening? what are the very first signs? Who tends to see them that, oh, wait, this is not going the way it's supposed to? Um, Again, Deanne, you've been in this role, on the inside of an organization. What are the first fire alarms?
And I think Tim kind of touched on this. It's alerts that you're getting from systems that are monitoring. It's systems that slow down, and you start to wonder, is something happening? You might get an email that is a phishing email, something like that. And sometimes it could be an employee that says to the help desk, my computer has slowed down, or I've gotten this alert on my computer, and I think something is maybe happening with my computer. So I think Tim probably touched on that and could probably go deeper into it.
Okay. How fast does that news then take place? Whoever first gets those first signs, what typically happens? Tim, maybe from your point of view, is this minutes or hours or days before, now everybody in the organization knows something bad's going on?
Yeah, I think it really depends on how mature the organization is as far as security goes.
Yeah.
I've in a prior life, I started an incident response practice in the consulting side, and have been through literally hundreds of incident response engagements, from ransomware, business email compromise, et cetera. And some of those were having a breach for months, right? And didn't realize it because they might have had the right tools, they might not have been looking at them, right? So the faster you can identify it and start responding, the more you can minimize the damage. I think preparation is key, right? We talked about that in the last webinar. But once the breach occurs, you have to have some sort of mechanism to put the word out and get all hands on deck, because this is really the worst case scenario where potentially something is happening, and we're gonna have to report it to the HHS and FBI and those sort of organizations.
I think it also highlights the importance of training your workforce to identify and report. Unfortunately, I have known of situations where a workforce member's computer had been infected and they chose to ignore the message that popped up for a year. And so, unfortunately, there was, a bad actor in their network for a long period of time and just gathering data silently. So I think workforce training is very important.
Ross, is there any downside to what Deanne was talking about, maybe from a legal or risk management standpoint of encouraging employees to raise their hand as quickly as possible when they suspect a breach?
No, I think that's exactly what you want. I think that's a hallmark of an effective compliance program, really, is folks understand what's bad and just alert somebody. And we'll get into it later on in the webinar, just how important having an incident response process in place, because you want that heads up, and you want folks like Tim and Deanne who understand what to do with the information to be able to quickly look at a situation and say, oh yeah, this is nothing, or this is something we're going to have to take a bigger look at.
Okay. With that, let's talk about the first 24 hours. So some alarms have gone off. Some people who are smart have been notified, and it's like, we really do have something in play here. Let's talk about what happens in the first 24 hours. Tim, again, let's start with the technical side of this, right? Because oftentimes our IT organizations are either seeing those alerts or they get those calls. When you think about it from a technical side, what do we need to be doing immediately?
Yeah, I think this is where your preparation comes in, where people know what they're expected, right? So doing tabletop exercises and going through that muscle memory so that when it does occur, you know who does what, right? Expect probably not to sleep very well, if at all, in the first 24 hours. If you do have cyber insurance, the sooner you can reach out to them and get their preferred forensic and IR vendors in place, the better. Going through and documenting your incident response plan and going through the steps, right? First couple steps are really identifying what systems are impacted, and then containment, right? Those are really the first two steps, and it's not linear, right? You're going to continue to do those steps, but isolating those systems so that it doesn't spread, so that, you know, if they are in a system, they can't continue to exfiltrate data. Communication is absolutely key, not just within IT, but also within the business.
So isolating the problem, does that mean we just go start unplugging everything?
No, you definitely do not want to shut down machines because you're going to be destroying forensic evidence.
Okay.
So using your endpoint solution to isolate it so it can't communicate to the internet, or you definitely can unplug the network cable or disable wireless NICs. So whatever, I've had some that pull the plug on their firewall, or the cord on their firewall to make sure no traffic was going in and out. So isolating those systems so that they can then be investigated and contained to see how bad the actual breach is.
Awesome. You mentioned 2 or 3 things. I'm gonna go to Roz for the first one and Deanne for the second one, and then all 3 of you for the third one. Roz, Tim talked about calling your cyber insurance carrier early. You know, most people have, you know, something horrible happen to their house. They're probably more worried about their loved ones and their belongings. They may get around to calling their property insurance carrier. Why is it so important to call your cyber carrier sooner than later?
Great
what
question.
happens when you do?
Right. Yeah, it's really important. And it's one of the things you don't want to sit on. Oftentimes, you know, you hear things in the media about people getting dropped from their cyber insurance carrier or their insurance carrier for some reason, right, for filing a claim. And certainly there's a risk there, but the risk you want to try to avoid is this. Your policy, if you have one, and you should have one, your policy really gives you a time frame that you have to report a potential incident to them. And what you want to avoid is waiting so long that you're beyond that required notification timeline, and then they tell you they're not going to cover the claim.
Right.
So you want to avoid that. It's kind of like a medical malpractice claim. You're going to notify your carrier as soon as, because you don't want to mess up that timeline. And then the second thing, to Tim's point, is you want to get who's on the panel for the forensics team. There's an attorney that's going to be paid for out of that policy, you want to get the panel of attorneys who you can select to help you with the process.
And it's interesting for people who have been through this. Sometimes they're a little bit surprised, but the cyber carrier, the cyber attorney, the forensics team, they're kind of in charge of the immediate response, right? And you want them to be, because they've got a lot of experience. We'll talk in a minute about negotiating with threat actors. It's like, you might have done some preparation, but that's what these people do for a living. And so they do kind of drive in the beginning, don't they?
They do, and to your point, you really want them to, because you want to have, you know, some prompt activity. The other thing I want to mention about attorneys is whether or not it's an attorney through your cybersecurity policy. One of the important considerations early on is whether or not you're going to engage counsel under attorney-client privilege to engage with your forensics company, et cetera. And the reason is, you know, a lot of times nobody is, you know, safe. People always say it's not if you have a cyber attack, it's when, because it's just kind of the world we live in. But oftentimes there are some failures or gaps in an organization's security posture and program. And so you may want that attorney under attorney-client privilege to direct the investigation and protect reports and information, even from the Office of Civil Rights sometimes, if you end up under an investigation. So it's a really important thing to consider early on.
It is weird to think about attorney-client privilege, you know, when like the barn's on fire, we're trying to put the barn out. But I think you hint at something we'll get at later. If you have a breach, it's probably not if you're going to get sued by somebody, but when. So having that privileged communication from the very beginning is important.
Exactly.
Yeah, the other thing that Tim mentioned was communication. We're going to talk about communication throughout the chronology because this too is really critical, and some of it's a little bit counterintuitive, particularly if uh, you've got clients that are affected. But again, having been on the inside, give us some guidelines on that initial communication. We're still in the first 24 hours. Employees are saying, "Why can't I log in?" Other people in a well-intentioned organization wants to tell everybody everything. Is that the right way to approach this initial communication?
I think that having a communication plan is key. It should be part of your incident response plan. It should be something that you practice, like Tim mentioned, in your tabletops, because then you'll begin to kind of hone in, what does that communication really need to look like? So I think standardizing the communication and not leaving people up to making up their own ideas about what's going on. And then also you have to think about oftentimes if you're in a healthcare facility, your employees are also your patients. And so you need to keep that in mind as well. But definitely having a standardized communication plan
Yeah.
is the best.
Yeah. And you've all mentioned tabletops, which we're going to come back to a little bit later because I think those are really important. I want to pause right here though, because a lot of our attendees are covered entities, right? They're the practice that's taking care of the patient. This breach might not have been quote unquote theirs. It might have been one of their
Mm.
software or IT infrastructure providers who is a business associate. Before we go any further, what kind of differences might there be if the breach occurred in a third party, a business associate, and now you're trying to deal with it as a practice? Your people can't log on to your EMR, for example, but the breach is on that side. How does some of these first 24 hours change if the breach is one of your partners as opposed to directly in your practice?
I think for me, I don't know that it really changes anything other than you have another layer that you have to get through to understand what's going on. I guess my number one advice I would give to a covered entity or a practice, a physician practice, would be not to just sit back and wait for them to give you information, to actually get involved and be engaged and ask questions, ask for proof, ask for documentation, but really get engaged in whatever's going on instead of waiting for them to provide you information.
But Tim, this is a place where the interest of the business associate, let's say the business associate had the breach, and their clients, the covered entities, get a little crossways, don't they, in terms of how disclosing that business associate who had the breach might want to be to their covered entity clients?
Yeah, this is where communication is key, right? Because you've probably seen some of the symptoms or you've heard rumblings that they're having an incident. But because it's not your environment, you're not totally sure of the scope of it, right? So unless they're communicating that to you, you really have to do your own due diligence internal to see how could this potentially impact us, and what controls that we need to potentially put in place, right? Do we need to isolate our, if they're on our network, or if we have a connection to them, a VPN to them, do we potentially need to, take that down to protect ourselves until they're, they've gone through their investigation. So that's where you really have to, I completely agree with Deanna, right? You have to, communicate with those folks, and you have to be proactive and do your own due diligence internal.
But Roz, this gets us to our lovely business associate agreements. We've all got drawers full of them. We've signed them. We didn't want to pay the attorneys to read them. They're just boilerplate. They're stuck on the back end of the contract, right? Um,
Mhm.
you're like,
This is
no, not
really,
so much.
and actually we run into it a lot, and oftentimes, sadly, it's in response to a breach and dealing with it that folks begin to understand what's actually in their business associate agreement and maybe are even proactive in putting some language in there. But as the physician practice, as the covered entity, anything that happens through a contract you have with someone doing something for you that impacts PHI, that responsibility rolls up to you as a covered entity to make sure you're notifying patients, you're notifying the Office of Civil Rights if you have to, you're notifying the state attorney generals if your state requires that.
Right.
And so the language in your business associate agreement on this particular topic is important. So like some homework following this webinar would be go pull your standard agreement and see what it says. And it might say to your business associate that they're required to report to you within 3 days of becoming aware, or sometimes the business associates will try to negotiate 30 days or 60 days. You see all sorts of things across the board. And you should look at that because you as the covered entity have 60 days to report to OCR if you have to, or to patients. And your business associate has some time too, but you want to line those timelines up and make sure that doesn't put you, the covered entity. The other thing I'll say, and I know you want to move on from this topic, but the other thing is sometimes the agreement will say who's responsible for notifying the patients.
Right.
And sometimes the agreements will say what information do they have to provide you in a certain time frame. So it's all becomes, once you get in a breach situation, it's like, okay, some of this language actually does need to be addressed.
I think 2 key points there. You don't want to be reading your homeowner's policy while your house is on fire.
Right.
So read your BAAs ahead of time. And number 2, just remember, you are the covered entity. You've delegated things on your behalf to the business associate. That's what those agreements are for. But the patient did not give their information to the EMR company. They gave them to you, the practice. So you're the one with the fiduciary responsibility.
I think I would add one more just real quick recommendation, and that is have your downstream vendor sign your business associate agreement, not you sign theirs, because it is you're in control of that situation. So that would be my last piece of homework.
And I'll also say, even though in this case, Focus and Coker are business associates in many instances, as the covered entity, you really are in the driver's seat to have your version signed because vendors want your business. And so they're more inclined to sign your version if you present it at the front end, as opposed to after the fact. So think about your process there too.
There are a lot of questions that come up in these first 24 hours. We could probably talk about all of them, but one of the ones that's top on everybody's mind is, okay, this particular type of attack, it's a ransomware attack. Understand we've had a breach, the bad guys have got control, and now we get some mysterious message demanding, some Bitcoin or something. Let's talk about ransomware. How do you decide if you're the victim of a breach? One, what's it look like, right? How does that interchange go between the bad guys, the threat actors, the official term? And how do you decide if you're going to pay the ransom?
Yeah, I guess I'll start there. And ransomware, it has kind of morphed and it continues to morph throughout the years as the attackers try to find new ways to get payment, right? So ransomware and extortionware, right? So where they don't actually encrypt, but they steal your data and then make you pay so that you don't leak it and embarrass you. This is one of the easy ways, and I say that tongue in cheek, to know that you're breached, right? The attackers put a big flashing message on your screen, or they put a file on your desktop saying, "Hey, we're X attack group, and we breached you. Go to this, Tor website and pay us money." So that's pretty obvious. The part whether to pay or not, it's kind of a philosophical question, but it's more of a business decision. And a lot of times the cyber insurance company's IR vendor recommends you pay it. But it's really up to the business on Do we pay that or not? And what does that get us? I've been in those rooms where we're discussing it, and you know, I remember one where the CEO asked, okay, so we pay. Does it make everything stop? Like, no, you still have to go through the exact same steps as if you didn't pay, right? You have to investigate all these machines. You have to go restore, recover, harden your machine so it doesn't happen again. But the only thing that paying is going to help is that they won't leak, that you were breached, right? So,
but let's be honest. We're negotiating with bad guys who broke in and stole our stuff, and they say, if you give me a bunch of Bitcoin, I promise I won't resell it on the dark web. And we're like, oh yeah, they're very trustworthy. I mean, there is actually no guarantee that even if you pay it,
No guarantee. Mm-mm.
Roz, is there anything legally in those inevitable lawsuits that may come, right, from patients or class action lawsuits or whatever it may be? Does paying or not paying strengthen or weaken your legal case in any direction?
I don't believe so. I mean, paying it really is a business decision, and oftentimes, if somebody feels stuck, meaning they didn't have redundant systems, they don't, it's something that's locked their EMR down
Yeah,
and they can't
right.
get access. Sometimes, we see practices get kind of scared and just, I got to get stuff moving again. And so they just
Yeah.
want to pay. It's not going to impact whether or not a patient decides to file a privacy lawsuit.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah.
What's going to impact that lawsuit, or what were your gaps leading up to the breach? Did you
Right.
know about them?
Right.
Why didn't you have a full security program in place? And what did you do once you knew? And
Yeah.
so I think those are the two things that really impact it. But whether or not you pay, I mean, to your point, it may have already be all over the dark web, or
Yeah.
whatever it's called, and you're just kind of playing with a dishonest set of individuals.
And I knew this is one of the reasons you want your carrier, you want your forensics experts in play, because oftentimes they know the group. They can identify the threat actor, and they actually have the history. This is okay. They asked you for $250,000. We know that through some back and forth negotiation, if you decide to pay, you can pay 75,000 and they'll accept it, right? That's where their experience doing this every day helps.
Yeah.
Deanne, one of the other really big questions before we move on is, was my data stolen? Was it exfiltered? Why does that question matter? We've been breached. Somebody punched a hole in our wall, whether it was a big wall or a little wall. They've been breached, so we've got some liability. Why does it matter on the forensics question of whether or not they took my data?
If the answer is yes, it's a breach. That's a short response to your question. But if they take something that is not theirs, it's a breach. So it's very important.
The flow chart ends with a very simple. Tim, how did the technical folks identify whether or not data was or was not exfiltered? Is there little digital fairy dust and footprints and?
Yeah, this often comes up whenever the business folks starting getting involved in a breach, and I've been in so many calls where I wanted to, the lawyer gets on or the CEO gets on and says, I want to know with 100% certainty whether or not data was exfiltrated. Like, well, we probably should have had this conversation 2 years ago, so we put the right tools and controls in place so that we could identify what was on that machine and did it flow out, right? So. Yeah, unless you have certain controls in place before the breach, this is a guessing game to see what data was on that machine. Did it go out or not? So you really need to think about these things before, and preparation is so key to incident response, because it becomes a guessing game if you don't have those tools and controls in place.
Got it.
And I would say one of those things would be audit logs. Every system comes with auditing capability for the most part. They have default settings. They may not retain your logs very long. You need to have that discussion. Is this a system I want to retain logs longer?
Yeah.
Where are the logs? Can I read the logs?
So the point
So
is, if properly prepared, yes, you can know. If not properly prepared, you aren't sure.
it's a guess.
You guys are not talking nearly fast enough because I'm looking at the clock and we got a lot left. I'm kidding. We knew we had too much. Let's go to kind of the next phase. We've got this first 24 hours, and again, everybody is panicked, and we're on calls 3 times a day, and the IT team has not slept. Now we're like, okay, we're beginning to work through this. We're trying to get back up, right? And we all know a very large breach story that happened last year that was literally months, right, before full restitution. A lot of stuff starts to happen after the immediate panic, and life is still very unusual and very crisis driven for a while. Again, I want to kind of walk down our list of bullet points here. Tim, let me start with you. What are I get you'll have lots of woulda, coulda, shoulda IT conversations, and you'll have lots of things that once things calm down, let's prepare. But in this return to operations and immediate vulnerabilities, what are the 2 or 3 most important things people ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think in going through these, right, people want to rush it. You really can't, or you're going to end up in the same situation. So this is where you really need to, again, go back through the identification. What systems are impacted? Have we isolated those and making sure that the other systems aren't impacted? And then doing a prioritization. And this is where I've seen over the last 5 years, and a lot of it has been driven by ransomware, that the incident response plan has been tied into, or should be tied into, business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans, so that you go through a business impact analysis to see what are our most critical systems. When do we need those back up? What are the things that tie in with those, right? I might get an application up and running, but it needs email access or needs phone at system access, right? So having a prioritized list of what systems need to come up first and what ties in with those is absolutely critical in being effective in getting those back up and running.
And
And then,
Deanne, when you were, to Tim's point, when you were sitting there operationally, that's an interplay between what the business needs are and then the technical infrastructure, because some have dependencies on another. How did you all work through sort of prioritizing what comes back online when you
Patience.
patients first,
You wanted
obviously.
shorter answers, patience.
Patients, exactly.
I mean, really, if you're a healthcare provider, you want to be able to take care of your patients.
Yeah.
The business side will be, focused on trying to get the business
Yeah.
side of
Yeah.
things back up and going. But really, we're in the business of healthcare, and
Yeah.
patients are a priority.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to talk about real liability, which we're going to get to in a minute. That's there.
Mhm.
All right, Roz. So we get to this question of notification, right? We
Mhm.
all know about the Office of Civil Rights, OCR's wall of shame, right? Where if you have certain things that are listed there for all the world to see, um, give us a 100,000 foot view of kind of what you have to think about on notifying lots of
Sure.
folks.
Well, one of the things as you're going through your internal assessment of what happened is starting to gather, once you realize you do have a breach and an affected system or whatever, is identifying the actual individuals who are affected by the breach, including not only their names, but where do they live? What's their address? And why does that matter? Because number one, you need to know the volume of affected individuals, because
Yeah.
that impacts if you're reporting to OCR right now, or if
Right.
you're reporting to them at the end of the year. So, right,
Yeah.
500 or more, it's going right to the OCR. 500 or greater, you also have to notify the media. Less than that, you don't.
Yeah.
So that's an important, you need to know who's affected, where do they live, because you may also have an obligation to notify your state attorney general.
Yeah.
And they may have their own process. And if you identify that your EMR was accessed and you've got patients in 16 states, well, all of a sudden now you have to start considering 16 AGs that need to be notified
Yeah.
as well. So
Yeah.
there is a ripple effect. So so really those are the agencies, and of course the individuals affected, you have to notify them
Yeah.
within 60 days. So
Yeah.
lots to do.
Well, Yeah, and apparently, again, that certain famous unnamed breach, half of America got a letter at some point, right?
Right,
Theoretically. Okay.
right.
Look, we could have a long conversation just about financial, reputational, operational cost. I mean, a breach has, to go back to Tim's analogy, we broke something and had surgery. Rehab is a long, long time, if I torture the analogy. Do you
Mm.
have any rules of thumb on, what just on the financial side, what the cost of this level of a breach can really turn out to be?
I can say people are guessing it wildly. It can be as much as $4.5 million.
Yeah,
That's kind of an average. It can certainly go up from there.
right.
But when you think about cost, you have to consider the cost of a notification, which is not cheap, the cost of any remediation you might offer them, like credit monitoring. But then you also have the other cost, which is just the time it takes to report to OCR if you're answering various questions, the people that are involved in that. And then you have all of Tim's side, which is the IT stuff. Do you have to replace servers? Do you have to replace computers?
Uh,
The cost is so wild.
Yeah,
It's so hard
yeah.
to guess, but it's large. Let's
Mhm.
just say
And
that.
it's not just as simple as, well, I've got cyber insurance. Once I pay the deductible, I'm good. A lot of these things can easily outkick the coverage of cyber, where
Yeah.
you've got very significant exposure
Mm.
Yeah.
beyond the coverage limits of your policy.
Yeah.
Well, and another thing to think about, obviously your legal fees if you're using attorneys, but if the OCR investigates you and you can guarantee you'll be under an OCR investigation if you're on the higher end, right?
Right,
Over
right.
500 affected individuals, the time, more legal counsel
Yeah,
responding, as Deanne said. But then if you have fines, and the
yeah,
OCR has a pretty defined structure for how they
yeah,
assess fines, but you're looking at up to 1.5 million in fines per type of breach,
yeah,
per type of
yeah,
issue that
yeah.
results in the breach. So
They can
it goes
stack.
on for longer than you expect, and it definitely goes higher than you can even imagine in terms of
Mhm.
cost.
All right. So we're all now appropriately scared. You three have done your job. Let's close this by, there's a bunch of stuff that's better and cheaper, right?
Mhm.
Um, you, Dean, you mentioned incident response plan. You've also all talked about tabletop exercises. Talk a little bit about those things first, Deanne, and then, Tim, we can talk a little bit about IT prevention, and Roz will talk about some legal prevention. So, Deanne, what have you found really effective on incident response plans, tabletop exercises with the organization? What would be your thoughts there for folks?
Well, I think first of all, an incident response is just paper. And
Yeah,
so unless you do a tabletop to test it or have an actual incident to test it, you really have absolutely no idea how good it is. You
right.
can create a plan and it can look great on paper. And then you have to use it and
Yeah,
you realize there's large gaps of
yeah,
information that we just didn't think about. So it starts with, you know, communication plans and
yeah,
detection and response. And
yeah,
it can be, like I said, you can think you have a great plan until you have to use
yeah,
it. And I'm sure Tim can share more about that.
yeah.
But
And a lot of people might say, well, okay, we wrote it down on paper. We're really good in healthcare writing stuff down on paper. Joint Commission taught us well, right? And then tabletop exercise just means we talk through that. But
mhm,
that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about simulating, hey, you were at dinner with your family and you got the
mhm,
phone call from the IT department. Let's all, that's what
mhm,
you're talking about. It's like a literal simulation of a breach,
Mhm.
right?
mhm.
Yeah.
Why won't organizations do that? Is it just, oh, that just feels like it's way too cumbersome, and we'll figure it out when it really
It
starts
can be
happening.
time consuming
Mhm.
Yeah,
to really do it well. I
right.
mean, again, you can have a great looking incident response plan and you can do a okay tabletop drill, but if you really want to do it well,
Right.
That's when you really find out where your gaps are.
Got it.
And
So-
time is money, right? Providers
Yeah,
are trying to take
yeah.
care of patients and bill those
Right.
claims out. And I'm
Right.
pulling now staff and
Yeah.
providers out of patient care.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Look, there's no convenient time to do the fire drill, right? The teacher's right in the middle of
never.
the lesson and the
Mhm.
alarm goes off, but that's the whole point.
Mhm.
Tim, I know your time is really short, so I'm asking you an unfair question because there are a million things you could do on the IT side for prevention. If you had to give people the top one or two things you would say, do this always, what would you say?
Yeah, I think the way I always look at it is looking at current breaches and looking to see what causes those, right? So you kind of have the preventative controls, the detective controls, and then kind of the recovery piece, right? So if everything breaks down, make sure you have backups of everything, right? And focus on the areas of highest risk. We know from seeing statistics that most breaches occur through end users, right? So focus on email security, focus on endpoint security, focus on training your users. I would say users are vulnerabilities that you can't fully patch, right? You have to continue to stay in front of them and hope that they do the right thing. I think Deanna said earlier that you want your users to be involved. You want them to report, oh, I got this email, I clicked on this link and it didn't sit right with me. So, can you go check it in the logs, right? So those are the areas I would focus on and monitoring of your environment, 24/7 monitoring of your environment so that you're identifying these things even when people aren't in front of screens. And doing that will get you in front of the incident quicker, so that hopefully you can minimize the damages as much as possible.
Roz, one of the questions that's come in, I ask, are there some priority either topics or sections in the business associate agreement, if you've got a drawer full of them? Are there a handful of questions you ought to have written down somewhere, like this one has? You mentioned notification time frame. Are there other things on the BAA that you would encourage people to concentrate on?
There are, and actually, I think we'll make this available after the webinar, but we have a checklist that we give out to folks that they can run through their business associate agreements. What's required, is it in there? And what are some other considerations? Things like cybersecurity, insurance, et cetera. So we'll make that available after. I think that'll provide lots of information there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a question in the chat. I thought we could just go ahead and loop in about what do you do when your business associate doesn't want to sign your business associate agreement. And there are some large vendors, Google, Amazon. If you use Amazon Web Services, Google will not sign your business associate agreement. So there are times when you have to sign theirs. If it's not someone like a Google or an Amazon who will not negotiate with you, my recommendation is to use that checklist and then push back. If they want you to sign theirs, then look at the things that are most important to you and push back on their BAA template, like the time it takes to report a breach.
And again, you as the covered entity really are in control because you are contracting to have them do something for you. And so you have to also be willing to walk away. If they're not going to budge and it's something that's important to you, you may have to say, I'm going to go find some other vendors to talk to. And as in-house counsel, once upon a time, I hated negotiating business associate agreements because there's always issues and it can be difficult, but you have to be willing to insist on what you believe is important to you.
I think also make sure you understand what is a required element of a business associate and what is just a recommendation or a good best practice. Because if their BAA is missing a required element, I wouldn't sign it.
Yeah. And there's always pressure, right? Because we're trying to get a contract done and move on to whatever. But yeah, don't skip it. I know our time's short, but there's a couple of really good questions. I want to get a quick answer from you on. Look, interoperability, we as an industry got told by the federal government before they gave us, $35 billion, hey, you guys need to share data. And one of the questions is, okay, I have payers and other people trying to asking to access my cloud-based EMR, right? So interoperability is supposed to make data flow faster, reduce the silos in healthcare, hopefully lead us to better outcomes, lower cost. It has very, very noble goals. And then I think what this person's asking is, okay, I'm sitting here listening to you all, and that feels like that's creating some vulnerabilities. Should you say no if somebody wants to get at, your cloud-based data in the name of faster, more efficient, coordinated healthcare? And if you say yes, what should you do to mitigate your risk? Tim, maybe that's a question for you on the technical side.
Yeah, I would say, and it's kind of a cop out, but I mean, it's a business decision, right? Why do they want, why are they asking for access? What do they need access to? Can we limit it down to only those things that they actually need access to, right? So, I mean, role-based access controls and minimum necessary, rights, things like that, and then monitoring. Are they, handling the data correctly and accessing the right elements of data?
As business owner executive, this is a place I will defend the IT folks. There is a place that it is a business decision, right? Tabletop exercises, you got to make a business decision on what kind of downtime are you willing to spend to be prepared? What level of these kind of advanced tools, what level of friction are we going to put in the user identification process that slows down business but adds protection? And at the end of the day, all the technical people, whether they're technical compliance or technical IT, can do is tell you what your options are, tell you what your risks are, tell you what that's going to cost. But if you're the owner of the business, you have to make those trade-offs.
I'll say one other quick thing. I would rather give them access to cloud-based EMR, and be able to control that and monitor that than having them sending spreadsheets back and forth through email or something that's probably more insecure.
Exactly. Yeah, you're probably going to give some access. There's a right way to do it, and credible players and those types of things. Right. This last question, somebody asked if we could recommend cyber carriers. That probably would not be wise on our part. However, Roz, Deanne, Tim, do you have any guidelines on if somebody was looking at cyber insurance carriers on think about these 3 or 4 things before you pick your carrier or your plan? Other than what one executive told me is like, I don't know, just buy as much coverage as you can, seems to be the only answer. Any guidelines on picking a cyber policy?
Gosh. I mean, I think you want to have somebody who's got good ratings, obviously. You want to see if you can determine any history for dropping clients,
right,
based upon a single episode. Yeah. This is, talk to some of your colleagues and see who they're using and if they're satisfied with them. Right. It's kind of like you're shopping for insurance for your home or car. Yeah. You want to have somebody who's got a good reputation, who's actually going to partner with you when you need them. Yeah.
By the way, you would love to talk to your colleagues who have been through a breach to say, how did your carrier behave when it all hit the fan, as opposed to how were they in the sales process? Awesome. Well,
Tim, can I mention one more thing before we go that I think is really important that we didn't really emphasize? But your security risk analysis, your HIPAA security risk analysis that you are supposed to be doing annually is really critical. And it's critical because out of that SRA, as we call it, you're going to develop your remediation list. Here's all the things I need to work on, and here's their risk level so I know where to prioritize. And it's important because number one, you can put systems in place to protect yourself proactively. Number two, you can document and show the OCR if you have to, that you actually did what you were required to do and you were working through your list based upon highest to lowest risks. So just don't want to, can't underscore how important that is for everybody.
Awesome. Well, I can't thank you 3 enough. I feel like we literally were just getting started, and a lot of these topics could could be elaborated on a lot. So the answer to that is here's how to get a hold of our three guests. That you could get a hold of me, but I don't know anything. But as you can tell, Tim, Roz, and Deanne really have a lot of expertise. And what they do, what all three of them do every day is work with their clients to try to help keep them protected, because the bad guys aren't sleeping. They aren't letting up. They aren't saying, we've extracted enough money, we'll move on to something else. They like healthcare for lots of obvious reasons. And so if you've got additional questions on how either Coker or Focus could help you, take a picture of this slide and feel free to reach out to all three of them. I can't thank you all enough for sharing your experience, your expertise, and even at times maybe some of the pain of going through these with organizations. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for being here. Again, you'll get a link with the recording and a link to claim your CEU if you need that. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.